All right, I hesitate to ask the question. Can you hear me now? Good? All right. Wow, what a crowd. We're so delighted to have you all here, proving that San Francisco conservative is not just an oxymoron. Like East Berlin capitalist or Salt Lake City hedonist. So we know a lot of things about Vice President Pence, and we've known them for a long time. Man of faith, devoted father, committed patriot and constitutionalist. But I think there's something else we now can be completely assured of given events the last couple months that we didn't know before, which is that if we know nothing else about Mike Pence, we know now that his mortgage affairs must be in order. Right? So I don't know if the vice president gets tired of me saying this, but it's one thing to do the right thing when it's very popular and you're going to benefit from it. It's another thing entirely to do the right thing when it's really hard. And I will never stop believing that having Mike Pence in the position he was in early January 2021 was providential for this republic. Hey. And carrying out, are you kidding me? All right. And carrying out his duty that day, he earned the enmity of some of the dumbest and most poisonous people on our side, I hate to say. Lincoln used to like to tell a story of a guy in Illinois, a gentleman who offended some people in town. They tarred, they feathered him, they rode him out of town on a rail, and someone was kind of jogging along with him as he was going and asked him, so how do you feel about this? And the guy said, if it weren't for the honor of it, I really would have preferred to walk. And one of my favorite moments in the 2020 primaries and caucuses, I didn't have a lot of favorite moments in the 2024 primaries and caucuses was Mike was doing his duty, going from pizza ranch to pizza ranch. Now Mike is in Iowa, and I think Mike is too good a politician to admit that the pizza must be terrible there. I'm a New Yorker. I can't believe Iowa pizza is anything to write home about. But he had this guy who just wouldn't stop, stood up, you're a disgrace, you're a traitor, why are you even here, what are you doing? And the vice president said, well, you know what, I'm going to mark you down as a maybe. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the state of conservatism. One of our jumping off points will be the piece that the vice president wrote with the late Ed Follner that Chuck mentioned. And I think if you look at the state of our movement right now and what's happening in terms of our substantive goals, there's a lot of good things happening, but it's also very much a mixed bag. This might be an exaggeration, but it reminds me occasionally of a story Reagan used to tell about Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, and he was asked by someone, Mr. Premier, how would you describe the state of the Soviet economy in one word? He said, good. And then the interviewer asked, how would you describe it in more than one word? He said, not good. So I don't think we're quite in that situation, but it is a little bit of a mixed bag. So let me get you, Mr. Vice President, on two things before we delve in depth. Your piece, the meaning of it, where we are. Can you address, we had this horrible, hellish, literally, event in Minneapolis, these children killed, shot, and the first reaction of some really high-profile Democrats is, whatever you do, don't say thoughts and prayers. And I do think that's something that people say kind of in a rote way on X when they don't really mean it, but a lot of people are very serious about it. And the first thing they do when something like that happens is to get down on their knees And I just would like you to address the idea, as Mayor Fry said, that people need more than prayer because they need more than just words.
Well, and hello, everybody. It's an honor to be here, be back in San Francisco. And how about a round of applause for National Review and Chuck Duvall, the whole team. And I'm going to try and give Rich as hard a time as he's already given me before the evening is over. But I have to tell you, there's probably no voice in the conservative movement today, in the media or in print, that has more consistent and principled impact on behalf of American freedom than Rich Lowry. And I want to thank you for your stand.
Thank you very much.
First to your question. I retweeted today an article by National Review that I thought captured what most Americans are really feeling. And that is that there's something really evil afoot in the land. I mean, I've had the chance to serve in public life in the Congress as a governor, as your vice president. But if you know me well, you know I'm really just a dad, proud father here at the Marine Club of a major in the United States Marine Corps. One of my unworthy son-in-laws is actually a lieutenant in the United States Navy. And my daughter is, believe it or not, my daughter's a Yale law grad who actually became more conservative at Yale. We've got 4 of the most beautiful grandchildren in the world, going on 5. So let me answer it as a dad and a grandfather. What happened in Minneapolis was pure evil. And the first thing that one ought to do in the wake of such events is pray. Not the last. And the notion that there are voices in the country that have demeaned on some networks the idea of people pausing to pray. The shooting that took place through the stained glass windows at a church, cut down 2 little children, injured nearly 20 more. Really speaks not of our country, it speaks how disconnected some voices are in the public debate. Because I truly do believe that having traveled all across the country, the words I heard most, working rope lines, plunging into large crowds, when I was serving as your vice president, were 4 words. I'm praying for you. I heard them every day from people from all walks of life, in the city, on the farm. And this is a nation that believes in prayer. And I think there are lots of policy options in front of us that are not inconsistent with freedom and our constitutional rights that we ought to be talking about. And I'm happy to talk about that, particularly in the realm of institutional mental health care. I think we need to return this nation to a commitment to institutional mental health care in America so that people have places to go. But I would just tell all of you, you all are great admirers of National Review, and how about a round of applause for Briones? I want to thank the Briones Society. But as all of us process what happened this week in Minnesota, I encourage you to go to National Review and read that extremely thoughtful piece that just reflects on what we need to think about being afoot in the land and where we need to go to really revive the character of the nation. To me, that's faith and family.
And can you talk a little bit about Ed Fulner, who we just lost Ed Fulner. The vice president co-wrote this piece with him. Obviously, a great leader in our movement. Can you just share a little bit, maybe personally, and what the lessons are for how he thought about conservatism and work to advance it?
Well, thank you. I know National Review just marked the 100th anniversary of William F. Buckley's birth. And I say with some confidence that Bill Buckley would not mind me putting Ed Fulner on the same shelf as him.
Mm-hmm.
Where Buckley was the intellectual force that drove the conservative movement to the heights that it would achieve in the decades that followed, Ed Fulner was the builder. He built the architecture around the conservative movement, not just at the Heritage Foundation, which during so many years was the flagship of the conservative movement, where he served as president for some 50 years, but also so many other, the galaxy of state policy organizations around the country, part of State Policy Network. We're all born of Ed Fulner's vision, never drawing credit to himself, but saying, how can we push down and push out the resources of this movement in a way that builds up and equips men and women that embrace our principles of a strong defense of economic freedom, of traditional values into the fray. So Ed, for me, on a personal level, you know, I when I was first elected to Congress, I got tapped to lead the House Conservative Caucus in my second term. Ed Fulner was the president of the Heritage Foundation, a massive organization, a national figure that I had known from my days in talk radio. And I have a saying that I never think less of people who think more highly of me than I think of myself. And Ed, for some reason, early on, came alongside me and encouraged me and strengthened me. Even in those glory days, and you were there, Rich, causing just as much trouble as us backbench conservatives in the House, where the Bush administration was growing government and expanding entitlements. And we were in those fights, and I'll never forget being in a conference room in the Capitol building, and they had lined up the members of Congress who were holdouts and weren't interested in going with big government republicanism. And they hauled in these policy leaders with Ed Fulner right in the middle of the table, and they proceeded to tell these think tank leaders and policy leaders, you need to tell these people that they've got to get behind this bill. And a couple of them went along, and Ed Fulner, I used it many times over. He was like a boulder in the surf. He wouldn't move. And in the middle of the meeting, the majority leader was weighing into him, and the other leaders were weighing in. And I wrote a little note on Capitol stationery and slid it across to him that said, Ed Fulner, you're my hero. And he told me that for all the rest of his tenure at Heritage Foundation, he had that on his desk. And I was very humbled by that.
That's tremendous.
Ed had a great vision for what was at the core, not of just a political movement or a conservative movement, but the core of the American experience and American ideals. And I never imagined when he and I came together to write that piece in National Journal this summer that it might be his last word to the conservative movement. He left us suddenly, unexpectedly, but I invite you to give a round of applause for Ed Fulner, a man who leaves a legacy of leadership for which we should all be grateful.
So let's talk a little bit about that piece, because what you guys emphasized when you were elucidating what is true conservatism and what it really means was order. And you talked about this great book by Russell Kirk. We all tend to know The Conservative Mind, which is a good book, but in my view, his best book is the one they discussed in this essay, was the kind of the pillar of this essay, The Roots of American Order, making explaining just how deep all the ideas, all the institutions that sometimes we might think just, came from the head of Thomas Jefferson, like Athena from the head of Zeus. Just what deep roots they had for centuries throughout, Greek, Roman, and especially English history. But why order rather than freedom or principle? Why the emphasis on that word and that theme?
I've admired Russell Kirk since early on in my journey. In fact, if you read my book entitled "So Help Me God," which is available on Amazon.com and where all the books are sold, I ran for Congress a couple of times. I actually started in politics as a Democrat, but when I started to pay attention to what Ronald Reagan was saying and the ideals he gave voice to, I joined the Reagan Revolution. Never looked back. But after my first few failed attempts, I ran a little state think tank. And we invited Dr. Russell Kirk to come to Indiana to speak at a couple of dinners we put on. And he was noteworthy. He had a new book coming out. He would pass away just a few short years after that.
Maybe I don't want to get to know you too well, Mike. It seems like everyone's dropping off as soon as they have a collaboration with you.
There's a joke about a different vice president. The speeches were great, but what I'll always remember was our breakfast at the Holiday Inn the morning after he arrived. Because here I was at a pretty nascent conservative. I mean, I was enthusiastic, but not particularly well informed. And here I am sitting with a man who I think William F. Buckley would have conceded that Russell Kirk was the intellectual father of the modern conservative movement.
Absolutely.
So I'm sitting across the table from him at the Holiday Inn. We're enjoying a nice breakfast. And I literally looked at the father of the modern intellectual conservative movement and I said, so what do you consider yourself to be? Are you a conservative? Are you a libertarian? Are you a neoconservative? And he looked at me with the patience that sometimes older men will show with younger men, and he said, I'm a conservative. And then I really pressed my point, which is inconceivable to me now. But I said, what do you mean by that? And Russell Kirk looked at me and said, I wrote a whole book about that. And I'm going to send it to you. And he did. And so Russell Kirk has had a huge impact on my thinking. Still is. The Roots of American Order is epic, and I agree with you strongly. And it greatly informed our piece. But for me, the book, The Politics of Prudence, if you haven't read it, and you just want to have your sensibilities refreshed intellectually as a conservative, I've barely taken a vacation without a copy of it in my suitcase. But we just thought to focus on...
Your wife must love that.
Not really. So, but I will tell you that we thought the focus in this moment on order versus populism may strike a chord, and it seems to have. Mm-hmm. I've been humbled by the response that we've gotten for the piece. I'd be honored if any of you took time to read it.
So why is that? Why is that the opposition? Because a lot of populists will say order. Yeah, we love order. We're all in favor of law and order. We got the National Guard in various cities to prove it, with more on the way. What we don't like is your emphasis on individual freedom and overemphasis on the market, on these atomizing influences that classical liberalism has. So we're all with you on order. So how do you see that opposition? What's the tension there?
Well, it's when you think of the times in which we're living, I think there's a debate within, I won't say the Republican Party as much as I'll say the Americans who ever consider voting Republican. And that is, it's a debate between whether the party is going to stay on the track of traditional conservatism and preserving the foundations that have created the freest and most prosperous nation in the history of the world, or whether we're going to abandon that and embrace a populism unmoored to conservative principle. And what we sought to emphasize is that the bedrock of American prosperity, of American freedom, is found in in respect for and conserving those institutions. Now it's a tougher lift. I will tell you, I don't believe my old running mate is trying to drive an ideological outcome. I know President Trump better than his most ardent defenders. I really do. And apart from the difficult days at the end, I can tell all of you that he and I had a very good, close working relationship. And up until those final days, I'm very proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration. It was a conservative record for the American people. Cutting taxes, rebuilding our military, conservatives on our courts. But in the midst of all of it, it was very clear to me, Rich, that the president, he sometimes would correct me when I would say, or someone would say in the Oval Office, that you're a conservative. He would often say, well, common sense.
Yeah.
He's not ideological. And if he was sitting here instead of you, I think he'd be nodding, saying, right, I'm not ideological. But the challenge I think we have in our movement today, Rich, is there are ideological forces around him that are seeking to take that populist impulse on particular issues. Now, I'm very proud of what this administration has done to secure the southern border of the United States. I truly am. I'm very proud that we got all those tax cuts that we passed in 2017 passed intact. I'm very proud of the president's strong use of the United States military to take down Iran's nuclear capability. And the president's willingness not to cut Ukraine loose, even though many around him would have done that months ago, I think is commendable on his part, and I've said so. But in the movement today, and you know this better than most, there are people that are taking some of those populist steps that the president has embraced and trying to fashion that into a new agenda for a new right and a new Republican Party. But I see it, and my late friend Ed Follner saw it, as populism is just another form of progressivism. It's the dismantling of institutions and traditions upon which our freedom and our prosperity has been sustained. And I think it's the great debate that lies ahead in the next several years for our party.
Yeah, so there are a lot of sub-themes in that debate, and one of them is different attitudes toward process, right? So Trump's most devoted fans only care about results, and they don't care how you get there, whereas traditional conservatives have been very concerned with process for all sorts of reasons, one of which is it gives us an orderly society, guarantees an orderly society and orderly politics, and guarantees our freedoms at the end of the day. But how do you make the case for people who are just happy with the results, and there have been a lot of good results, so they're willing to overlook any pushing the envelope in terms of the rule of law, or exceeding his authority, or totally ignoring a congressional statute, as we're seeing with TikTok, who just don't bore me with that, because we need to focus on the results.
Our forebears, and we played a part.
This better be good after that pause.
Have created the freest and most prosperous and most powerful nation in the history of the world. But they created it on a written constitution. And the first order for the American people and for political leaders should be to preserve, protect, defend, and uphold the Constitution of the United States. Is it frustrating at times? Yes. I smiled when my friend Chuck Grassley, who is, I say with great affection, is an anvil that's worn out many a hammer. Saw where the president criticized Chuck because he was upholding a tradition in the United States Senate called a blue slip. I won't bore you with it, but it's a way of creating some balance in the appointment process. And the president took a shot at Chuck, and Chuck fired back. And
Chuck Grassley is almost old enough to run for president now.
I'm
He's
just-
he's getting there.
I'm just telling you, you're not gonna move Chuck Grassley, because he's a man that understands the strengths of the institution. He understands the separation of power. And when he pushed back, the president moved on. And it might well be a lesson for other members of Congress and of the Senate. But no, for me, I think that you put your finger on the impatience is understandable. We've gone through literally decades where liberals and progressives, Democrats, have driven our cities into bankruptcy and crime. We've seen the advent of a season where we're basically being told that this is as good as it gets. We're just going to have to make do. It's not going to be as good for your kids as it was for you. And I think part of what was President Reagan's appeal. I think part of what was Donald Trump's appeal in 2016 was just rejecting that. But I think it's incumbent on us to make sure people understand that the Constitution is not a barrier to resolving the differences in this diverse nation in which we live. It's actually the means. There's a marvelous book, if you like reading in this category, and I expect most people here do. Yuval Levin wrote a book entitled American Covenant, and a great friend of both of ours. And in the opening chapter of the book, he says, not only is the Constitution and its framework not a barrier to solving problems, it's actually constructed to bring together desperate voices and interests in a society and force them to work out their differences with principled compromise. And for my part, making sure that we preserve everything from the separation of powers to the processes and framework of the Constitution itself. I'm deeply concerned that about TikTok. It seems like a small issue. It doesn't get talked about very much, but think about this. Everyone from your local police officer here in California to the Vice President of the United States all take the same oath. You put your hand on your Bible, you raise your right hand, and you swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. You take the obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and you commit to well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office. And it ends with a prayer. So help me God. The President's oath of office is different in one respect. That the President takes an oath with the same solemnity that also includes a pledge to see to it that the laws are faithfully executed. The last Congress of the United States, in overwhelming and bipartisan fashion, passed a measure that said that TikTok is a national security threat. It is. It says that it's a threat to the privacy of the American people. It is. It's controlled and operated by the Chinese Communist Party. And every single day they're collecting data on 170 million Americans and have a propaganda platform of incalculable value. The Congress passed a measure that TikTok either needed to be sold to a domestic company or banned outright. Under our administration, our CFIUS committee, which is all the intelligence organizations, came together unanimously said TikTok is inconsistent with American security or privacy. The previous president signed that into law. It is the law of the land. The law itself provided for one delay if there was an imminent purchase. The administration is now delayed and delayed and delayed with no end in sight. And for my part, we ought to, as Americans, continue to insist that this president and this administration faithfully execute the laws of the land and either demand the sale or shut TikTok down. That's an example.
So, by the way, speaking of America's Judeo-Christian roots, which is a major theme in Russell Kirk's book, that title of Yuval's book, which is entirely appropriate, American Covenant, hugely consequential word, right? And just what you're talking about, the taking these oaths, so help me God. It goes how even our rituals and practices that you think are secular have this depth to them that has a religious dimension or resonance.
I think people understand that. And for my part, and thank you for the warm affirmation today about our service in those difficult days at the end. I can assure you whatever we did that day was by God's grace. But I remember thinking all along the way that I had made a promise to the American people on a cold day in January of 2017. A promise that I just recited. But I also made it to someone else. And for my part, that's what made the moment clear for me. You know, we're here in the Marine Corps Club, right? And I went down to the Flying Leathernecks lounge before, took some pictures because my son is actually in the squadron that historically has been called Flying Leathernecks. Michael's currently deployed overseas, and we're incredibly proud of him. But I'll never forget in the days leading up to those difficult days in 2021, my son looked at me and he said, "Dad, you took the same oath I took, and nothing else matters." And it set me to thinking that, you know, that these people that you remember in these hallways here have done a whole lot harder things than keeping their word. And they didn't have a choice when they were told to take that hill. And they took the hill, certainly for the person on their right and the person on their left. But they also took it because they took an oath. And it is a solemn oath. And I think, Rich, I think most Americans know that. They really do. I've been deeply humbled over the last 4 years how many people from literally every political perspective have taken a moment to say a word of encouragement to me in airports, and coffee shops. My wife always says, "Why do they have to tell you, half of them have to tell you that they don't agree with anything you stand for first?" But I always take that as a blessing because I think I said this recently at an event in Boston that the Constitution is the common ground on which we stand. I think we get back to that as Americans, we'll cure everything that ails this country.
So I'm going to ask one more question and then get to some questions that people submitted on cards. There are cards at your seat. If you have a question, scribble it down. We'll try to get to it. So I think that the big things that Trump has done the first six or 7 months here, most of which are very welcome. That you mentioned the border, which is absolutely huge. I think what they're doing against DEI is potentially historic. Bombing Iran, which you tend to kind of forget about, but in a lot of administrations would have been the biggest thing, you know, in the first 6 or 7 months. But the exception, and in my mind, and I assume yours as well, is tariffs. So this is obviously a major commitment of the president's personally for a very, very long time, literally decades. He talked about it a lot. He had this impulse in the first term. Didn't really happen, did in some respects, but now we've gone much bigger. What's the difference between the first term and the second term that they've come about here, and just how do you think about them politically and economically?
Well, first, I think implied in your question is really a great insight. It is different. It is different from our first term together. During I like to call them the Trump-Pence years. We used the tariffs and the threat of tariffs to achieve outcomes of lowering tariffs and leveling the playing field. The one exception on that, although that was ultimately our goal, was with China. We imposed $250 billion in tariffs on China just after years of trade abuses and intellectual property theft and military provocations, we changed the national consensus on China. And I think we ought to stay strong on that. But at the end of the day, the goal was free trade with free nations. And so I was in on lots of negotiations, particularly with the USMCA. And the goal was how do we lower tariffs, how do we lower non-tariff barriers and subsidies in a way that'll encourage commerce, but also first and foremost not disadvantage American workers and American businesses. There's a lot of sense that NAFTA had probably unintentionally created an incentive for companies to go south of the border, and we corrected that. We leveled that out while still preserving free trade. I'll never forget one negotiation with Justin Trudeau. And the president is, it's interesting to watch him work. Because he was on the speakerphone and he said, because there was something about milk in Wisconsin, which is a pretty big deal. And if memory serves, Canada was doing some kind of powdered milk, and they wouldn't give up on that milk, and it was disadvantaging milk in Wisconsin or something. So the president said, you got to come our way on that provision on milk. Oh, Trudeau said, we can't do it. We can't do it. We got a big dairy industry up here, Mr. President. We can't get there. And oh, you got to be there. So, can't, Mr. President, I appreciate your problem, but we can't do it. And Trump said, well then we're just going to tax all the cars coming in. And he said, what? And he said, we're just going to tax all your cars, everything that you ship into the United States. We'll tariff that. And Trudeau said, and I remember this, he said, well, that would destroy our economy. And he said, well, it probably hurt ours a little too, but he said, I don't want to do it, but, whatever, on the milk thing, do what you need to do. We got the change on the milk. And I saw that dozens of times. He's a good negotiator. He's got a great facility in that regard. But in this administration, what I've been concerned about, and the tariffs that we did were, not to be granular, but we're under Section 232. You have to document trade abuses and excessive tariffs, and then the Congress over the last 100 years has kind of shuffled off a little bit of tariff authority to presidents so they can just correct trade abuses. This time around, the president used an emergency statute and essentially declared a global trade emergency, using the statute in a way it had never been used before, and imposed unilateral tariffs on friend and foe alike around the world. Now, I'm somebody that believes that trade means jobs. I'm a unreconstructed conservative when it comes to trade. I'm always making sure we got a good deal, because our trading partners will have their barriers as well. We ought to work that out. But at the end of the day, your goal ought to be to 3 steps back and let the American people buy stuff where they want. But I think one of the remarkable things about this moment, Rich, is an awful lot of the president's most ardent supporters think somebody else is paying tariffs.
Mm-hmm. I know.
They do. God bless them. And it's because he's told them that, right? He and I had dozens of conversations about tariffs over the years, because I'm from a big trading state, Indiana, where we make a lot, we grow a lot, we sell it around the world. But the conversations go something like this. Presidents say, well, if they're going to sell into America, they got to pay. And I'd say, well, Mr. President, they don't actually pay. The importer in this country pays the tariff. They might take a little haircut, but the importer, and then ultimately the consumer will absorb that. And he'd look at me a little annoyed and say, I know how it works. And then he'd say, but they got to pay. I think the president has it in his mind that in some way tariffs come out of our trading partners, and the truth is they don't. I got quite a bit of traffic on a tweet I put out the other day. The White House actually put out a chart that showed the first 6 months of the Biden administration, federal revenues went like this. The first 6 months of the Trump administration, federal revenues went $150 billion higher. They put out a chart that showed that. And I simply wrote a simple tweet that just said, American businesses and American consumers pay American tariffs. Free trade with free nations. And it got, I don't know, a couple million views. So part of our challenge, and I think National Review is in the forefront of this as a media outlet, but our little group, Advancing American Freedom, is trying to educate and equip policymakers to understand that. Who pays the tariffs? Because it's coming down the tracks. And I asked a business owner, and I see people nodding, and there's a lot of very successful people in the room. I say, when is inflation going to kick in? They say, it's kicked in. If you saw wholesale prices the other day, they were up 4 times what they were projected to be up. So it's hitting in the warehouses. It just hasn't hit all across the board yet. But the train is coming down the tracks because a fundamental difference, forgive me for going long, but it's such an important issue. The fundamental difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 on tariffs is our goal was to get down tariffs, open up trading relationships. I believe this administration's goal is to end with a unilateral tariff of 10 or 15% on all goods coming into the United States. And that's fundamentally different industrial policy and economics for America. And I think at the end of the day, it'll stifle growth in our country in the long term.
So by the way, that Trump-Trudeau relationship, I think President Trump is the only leader of a country who's ever threatened to annex a sovereign neighboring country just because he found his counterpart annoying, which, for good reason, right? For good reason.
Well, I've studied a lot of history. That may not be true.
All right, so we got a lot of great questions here. So let's say you're back, you're governor of Indiana. Do you support or oppose mid-decade redistricting when we got this gerrymandering arms race going on?
Yeah. Well, I was asked by that a couple of weeks, and I've been in touch with some Indiana legislators that are going through that decision right now. And all I can say is that this is not a decision for the administration in Washington. It is a decision under the Constitution that belongs to the states. States under the Constitution control time, place, manner. I saw a statement out of the administration not long ago that said states have to do what the president tells them to do. In point of fact, they don't. And in Indiana, I've told my friends at the State House, you all do whatever you think is right. But in Indiana, unlike places like California on the other side of the aisle, you know, there are half a dozen to 10 Democrat states where our ticket 2 times over got 30%, 40% of the vote, and 15% of the delegation in Congress is Republican. There are some states where, like Massachusetts, where 30% of the state is Republican, and there are no Republicans representing them in the Congress. So, you know, the Bible says what you sow, you reap. And there's been excess overreach by the Democrats in this category, and Republicans now, it appears, have an opportunity to reset that. In Indiana, we actually, our tickets and the Trump-Vance ticket, I think, won about 60% of the vote last 3 times in Indiana, but about 82% of our delegation is Republican now. But I've said to all of them, the most important principle to me is that they understand this is their decision. And I'm going to respect whatever decision they make.
So you just mentioned you mentioned a couple times your posts on X. We got a question: how can we have conservative values thrive in this environment where there's a social media landscape that rewards populism and anti-Semitism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned before about TikTok. You know, I visited a year ago, January. I visited Israel and went to several kibbutz and Kfar Aza. I went to communities that are within line of sight of Gaza and saw firsthand the aftermath of what had happened there. And I'm deeply suspicious that in the aftermath of October 7th, it was not an accident that TikTok was flooded with pro-Hamas anti-Semitic propaganda. I don't know what the source was. Could have been from anywhere. But I think I think it played a role in what we saw emerge on campuses. And I got a lot of faith in American young people. I love visiting campuses. I teach at a Christian college. I'm going to be lecturing at a public university this fall. I love going. Young people in this country are great. But I remember seeing these anti-Semitic rallies, anti-Israel rallies, and thinking, I looked at my wife and I said, they can't possibly know what they're defending. They must have been told in this new social media environment that what happened was something other than the unspeakable brutality that took place. And a concert in a field took place against young people. They were out celebrating and enjoying the day. So for me, I wouldn't separate enforcing the law about TikTok from answering part of this question. But I think there's no place in America, online, on campuses, or anywhere else for anti-Semitism, and it needs to be universally condemned.
So you mentioned young people. What advice would you have to a young conservative person who wants to be engaged politically, but is worried about alienating people around them or losing friends over it?
Count on it. And you'll make more friends. Yeah, no, I always tell young people there's a real myth about when I was growing up, because all I ever wanted to be was the congressman from my hometown. And by God's great kindness, I had other opportunities. But there's always kind of that myth that somebody's going to call you and ask you to run for office. Nobody ever calls anybody. Maybe there's somebody in the room that got a call. I never got a call. So I always tell people the first rule in politics is show up. Got some bright young people in the room. Show up. Walk in the door. I remember I walked in the Marion County Republican headquarters in Indianapolis, Indiana. Right after I decided I was a Reagan Republican, Rich. And I walked into the office of the chairman, who was sitting behind his desk. And if all of you remember the Star Wars movie, this Jabba the Hutt, this guy looked alarmingly like Jabba the Hutt. He didn't get up. He stayed behind his desk and he said, "How can I help you, young man?" And I shook his hand as he sat there. And I said, "I'm Mike Pence and I'm here to join the Republican Party." I thought it was kind of a big deal. He obviously didn't. He looked at me and he said, "Well, it's not really something you join in Indiana." He said, we don't declare, so glad to have you around." So they put me to work. I was a precinct committeeman, I was a volunteer, I worked on election days. And I'm telling you what, these bright young people, these young men and women that are in here, I'll tell you what, you start showing up, you roll your sleeves up, you go to work, people will see your quality, and then you'll have more opportunities in front of you than you could imagine. So now more than ever, we need men and women of integrity and principle to step forward to serve their community, their state, their nation. And I encourage you.
So how do you think about the role of Congress in our system at the moment? I think one of the things our founders would be most shocked by is just the lack of institutional self-respect on the part of Congress. Has anyone even made a peep about it? Congress passes this law on TikTok, and the president defies it, and no one even says anything, let alone seriously fight it. Whereas the whole scheme, right, the Madisonian scheme, is having these branches of government that are jealous of their own power and compete in a healthy way with the other branches. But Congress has become so supine. How do you think about this, and what's to be done?
Well, first, I want to affirm the principle of the separation of powers. I remember back when I was jousting with a president of my own party over big spending, back when you and I first met. Sometimes White House people would come down and say, "Hey, you're a Republican, you work for the president." And I'd always say, I work for the people in Eastern Indiana. And I'm here to represent the values and principles that I told them that I'd represent if I ever got here. And I think the body politic was designed for that. I really do. Now, that being said, in the contemporary moment, I have a high regard for Speaker Mike Johnson and Senator John Thune as the majority leader. These are men I have. I've known John Thune since we were on the back bench of the Agriculture Committee 25 years ago. And he's a man of integrity and principle, and he's a gifted legislator. I think steering through that tax cut at a time that there were voices, Rich, that wanted to raise the top marginal rate.
Mm-hmm.
And I give Senator Thune and I give Speaker Johnson credit. Well, you didn't see friction between the two branches of government over that. There was plenty under the radar, I promise you. And I was very concerned. You had some of the more prominent voices on the populist right that said, we need to let the top marginal rate go up. Our little group did a back of the envelope on that and found that 50% of the people that would have a massive tax increase were actually pass-through businesses, small businesses in America.
Mm-hmm.
We put out a little piece. I think National Review actually covered it. We said, if the top marginal rate was allowed to go up, it'd be the largest small business tax increase in American history. I think John Thune and Mike Johnson and the Republican majorities in both chambers held the line on that quietly, firmly, and steered it through. But that being said, I do believe there is a moment right now where the Senate in particular could act independently that would be consistent with the founders' intent and also would strengthen the hand of the president. And that is, right now there are 85 co-sponsors in the Senate on a bill that would impose harsh secondary sanctions on countries that purchase energy from Russia. And 2 weeks after, well-intentioned, give the president credit, blessed are the peacemakers. I give the president all the credit in the world for trying to resolve Ukraine diplomatically. It's clear last night, I think the count was 600 drone attacks in Kiev and dozens of rocket attacks claiming civilian lives, all civilian targets. I would urge the United States Senate to pass the harsh secondary sanctions on Russia and put them on President Trump's desk. I think the president, the leadership has said, we're not going to do that until the president calls the play. But I think consistent with the constitutional framework you described, I think they ought to take the action, put it on the president's desk, and because I think Vladimir Putin, who I have met and spoken to, closer than I am to you, one-on-one, Putin's not going to stop until he's stopped.
Mm-hmm.
Putin doesn't want peace, he wants Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And until we raise the price, raise the cost to him, which secondary sanctions would do, also going ahead and claiming the $300 billion in frozen assets would do, I think we're going to continue to see this war rage on, lives being lost. And so I think this is a moment where the Senate could act, and I've publicly encouraged it.
I think peacemakers should be especially blessed when, upon meeting their adversary on a tarmac, a couple B-2s fly directly overhead. That's a very meaningful gesture. Yeah. So let's just stick with that for a moment, because one of the critiques populists make of more traditional conservatives is, look, you personally, but
they get personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You supported Iraq, it was a disaster. You supported Afghanistan, it was a disaster. We had these forever wars. They were costly in terms of blood and treasure. We didn't get anything from it, or didn't get as much as we were promised. That we have to turn our back on that. In fact, on all interventionism, I think a lot of the animosity towards Ukraine is on the part of populists who've kind of turned on foreign policy, who supported the Iraq war at the time, regret it, and now sort of want to take it out on President Zelensky, right? They want to pretend that this is the same kind of question when it's not, right? We don't have troops on the ground. We're just providing them support and material. There's a cost to that to us, but it's nothing like we were experiencing in Iraq and Afghanistan. But what do you make of that critique that comes from an element of the right.
Well, let's rewind. I don't accept critiques of our decision to go to war in Afghanistan, because we didn't start that war. We gave the Taliban an opportunity to give them up. They didn't. And President Bush rightly deployed U.S. forces. It would be years before we did, but we took down Osama bin Laden. And the decision to go into Afghanistan, to me, I was on the floor of the Congress when that vote was cast, and I don't think otherwise. With regard to Iraq, people, there was errant intelligence at the time. I stipulate to that, and difficulties along the way. For 10 years in Congress, after the initiation of hostilities in Afghanistan, I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I made a point to visit either Afghanistan or Iraq every year in 10 years. And I testify that there were mistakes made, a lack of focus, a lack of mission, a lack of, and the lives that were lost. I'll be, next week, my wife and I will be traveling. We lost a remarkable American hero this week who was injured 15 years ago and just succumbed from his injuries. Michael Verardo, remarkable man. His wife's extraordinary. They've been champions of wounded warriors while he himself went through 130 surgeries. So I don't gainsay that of the prize. But I think it's contributed to that deep skepticism that people have and the assumption about Ukraine. But as I've said since the outset of the war, and I've been to Ukraine twice since the Russian invasion, the people that say that giving Ukraine the means to defend their nation will result in World War III need to study World War II more. Russia launched an unprovoked invasion 3.5 years ago with the sole aim, they thought it would take days, not even weeks, to take over a sovereign nation adjacent to them, a nation that had disarmed its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees by the United States and promises by Russia. I simply hold the view that if we were to allow Vladimir Putin to roll over Ukraine, it would just be a matter of time before he crossed the border that our men and women in uniform would have to deal with him. I remember I said that once to Tucker Carlson, and he said, well, and he's one of the leading isolationist voices in the country. He said, well, that's a better argument than I've heard. And I said, well, I have no doubt. I've been to Estonia. I've met with leaders there. Russia's made no secret of the fact of that land bridge. They have a great deal of interest in claiming that back. And Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania know it. And I remember he said to me, well, my son would never go to war to defend Estonia. And I said, well, my son's in the military. So he probably would. Because we have an Article 5 commitment under NATO that an attack on one is an attack on all. It's only been used once. It was after a day in September in 2001. And nobody in that coalition said, well, that didn't really affect us. They all said, we're with you, we're going. And they went. And so I think this is a moment where we have to convey to the American people consistently what the real risk is. And the worry that I have is that this populist movement, this isolationist movement, and I've said this publicly, so I'll say it to all of you, Donald Trump is not an isolationist. Mm-hmm. It actually, I think, we can talk later whether he's a protectionist, but thanks for not laughing at that. But he points to protectionists in the past with some affection, but he's not an isolationist. His bias is lead. Mm-hmm. His bias is to initiate. His bias is to set the agenda. That's just who he is. Mm-hmm. And but he's got voices around him that would promote isolationism, much in the way Republicans did in the 1930s in a movement that was called a familiar type. And I really do believe that the Bible says there's nothing new under the sun. What is now has been before. I look at where we are as a nation today and the rise of authoritarian dictatorships in Russia, in China, North Korea, and menacing out of Iran. And I just think this is a time when America, as the leader of the free world, needs to lead the West in defense of freedom.
All right, so there's a recent book by Alex Karp, of course, the founder of Palantir, brilliant and really thoughtful guy, that calls for a closer relationship between Silicon Valley, tech entrepreneurs, and government. What's your take on this? And given what's happening with Intel, maybe Mr. Karp's going to get more cooperation than he wants. But what's your take on this?
Be careful what you wish for. Yeah, I will tell you that when you have Bernie Sanders praising the Intel deal, probably all you need to know. I mean, Bernie is the nicest socialist I serve with in the Congress, but he's a socialist, makes no bones about it. And this notion of state-owned enterprise, I will tell you, men and women. Now I know I've been doing the rounds in the area and met with a lot of good people, and Intel's had its problems. Probably a major shot in the arm here by the federal government. Going to help them in the short term, but I'm telling you what, if we walk away from free markets, free enterprise, limited government, we're going to pay a price in innovation and in growth, and I hold to that. In terms of, I think there's a natural relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., because what they're developing each and every day with artificial intelligence artificial intelligence has existed in Washington, D.C. for 250 years. That's what we call in my house a dad joke. No, I think there's got to be cooperation. I think we've got to have a really deep conversation about AI, artificial general intelligence, what that means, the pursuit of that here. Many of you are likely involved in and around that space, and I commend you for it. But I was fascinated by a piece that I read just in the last couple of weeks, and I talked to some entrepreneurs this week about it, that while we're focusing on AGI, trying to reach that one artificial intelligence that I can't even describe it, it's just thinks, right? That the Chinese actually are taking existing artificial intelligence and implementing it in practical ways that actually increase productivity and increase outcome. And so I think we need to have a deep conversation about the role that AI is going to play in our economy in a way that will facilitate growth, promote freedom. And I also, can I say one more thing on this? I don't know if you all saw the news about this, but I've seen now 2 stories of teenagers who got on ChatGPT and dialogued with ChatGPT about suicidal thoughts and would go on to claim their lives. And the parents were never made aware of that. And I spoke to a local friend that's involved in a new alternative to ChatGPT that's grounded in values. It's called GLOO, G-L-O-O, and a lot of churches around the country and colleges, faith-based colleges around the country are now using this, making this available. And so I also think we've got to think hard about making sure that these new platforms respect life and respect the cherished liberties and values of the American people.
So we're just running short on time. So a few more questions, kind of lightning round style, if you don't mind. What's What's the best thing about campaigning for office and the worst thing about campaigning for office?
Best thing about campaigning for office is just the people. And it's the reason why somebody asked me today, they said, did you think you were going to win in 2016? Absolutely knew we were going to win. You can look it up. Look it up on YouTube. I was on with Chuck Todd on Meet the Press. It's 10 days before the election. Every poll showed us losing by 3 to 5 percentage points. So I'm on with Chuck Todd. I don't know, I was in studio. Maybe I was passing through Washington. And Chuck looks at me and he does, almost in a sympathetic tone, Rich. He says, so what do you think's going to happen? Because that week Hillary Clinton was announcing cabinet choices, right? But it was like, and I said, and I looked at him and I sat up real straight and I said, I think we're going to win. And he was shocked. And he literally said, why do you think that? And he said, every poll in the country says you're going to lose in 10 days. And I said, sure. I said, because I'm out with people every day. I'm out talking to real people. I mean, I'd always tell people if you want a big rally, send Donald Trump in. If you want a small rally, send Mike Pence in. But they were all the same people. And they came from every walk of life. And they were coming up and saying, I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to Mr. Trump. I know we can be better as a country. I know we can be stronger as a country. People were tired of being told. They were tired of being told this is as good as it gets. Tired of being told that our best days are behind us. And I always used to say, they were tired of being told, as Ronald Reagan said, that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital could plan our lives better for us than we can plan them ourselves. And I just knew it. And that's where, to this day, my confidence comes from. I mean, the American people know who they are. They know what our ideals are. And I hold the view the American people are the most generous, innovative, patriotic, caring, creative people the world's ever known. And so that's what is the best part of campaigning, is just being reminded of who the American people are.
And the worst?
The food, generally. I'm still trying to lose that weight. Yeah.
So what's your favorite thing to do with your downtime?
Grandkids. We've had 4 grandkids since we left office, which I like to call a good start. We go, as my brother often says, we go for quantity, not quality. We hope my son will be back from deployment just in time for the birth of his 3rd, and we're just blessed. And that's every chance we get. It's time with our kids. And because somebody asked me the other day, they said, "What do you think your legacy is going to be, Vice President Pence?" I said, "Michael, Charlotte, and Audrey." That's all. You know, when they're thriving, and remarkably, 3 of my kids their families are all serving the country. That was never intentional on our part, but they've all found a way to serve.
Yeah, well, that's not a coincidence. Not a coincidence, I assure you.
Well, it's a blessing, and that's what we're about.
So, favorite book, and I'll stipulate not written by Russell Kirk.
Oh, well, the book I read every morning has the letters HOLY on the front. But can I go beyond that one? Soldier of the Great War by Mark Halperin.
Oh, yeah.
You know this book? I can't say I've reread it. In one of his other books, Mark said he didn't believe in rereading books because a good book ought to change your life. Good book ought to change your life. And I read that book probably in 1995, and it's still, to me, a defining book about being a person of ideals and principles and carrying those forward, while at the same time understanding that your family's everything that matters.
Ladies and gentlemen, Vice President Mike Pence.
Thank you. Thank you. That was